had. These days, there's much more, thanks to the activists like Cheryl Chase and others who started getting the pediatrician's attention. Hey, you need to think about that. You're doing elective surgery on an infant who cannot possibly have informed consent. And so these days is more of a wait-and-see attitude, which I think is absolutely so. Wait till they're grown up and ask them then if they want to have surgery. And my guess is most will say no. I think that's been the pattern so far. So these are females who were exposed to more testosterone than other females. So does that mean that they're going to be attracted to women when they grow up? And the answer is, well, interestingly, if you look at groups of women with CAH, they are more likely to be same-sex attracted, to be lesbians, than the population at large. But most of them are straight. But what's interesting about that is the older they get, as you keep surveying them, the higher the percentage of them that report having a lesbian orientation. So it's possible, first of all, that indicates that, yeah, maybe prenatal testosterone increases the odds of them being lesbians when they grow up. And you also wonder, well, how many of them always had that same-sex attraction, but, were following the pathway society laid out for them. And then as they get older, they say, well, no, screw this. I know who I'm attracted to. I don't have to fit the heterosexual mold. And so it's that's entirely consistent with the idea that prenatal testosterone makes you more likely to be attracted to women when you grow up. There's another syndrome that I know you've talked about, which is androgen insensitivity syndrome, sometimes abbreviated AIS. And it turns out the gene for the androgen receptor that responds to testosterone and other androgens is on the X chromosome. And it may sometimes be that a woman will have an X chromosome that has a copy of the androgen receptor gene that doesn't work. And if she passes that X chromosome on to a daughter, then she's sort of duplicated herself. What's interesting is when that X chromosome is given to a son. In other words, that egg with an X chromosome that has a dysfunctional copy of the androgen receptor gene, if it gets fertilized by a Y-bearing sperm, now we have an XY individual. And as you've explained clearly in your basics podcasts, we know what'll happen in development. The Y chromosome will mean that the indifferent gonad will develop as testes. The testes will secrete two hormones that are going to guide sexual differentiation in the periphery, one of them being anti-Müllerian hormone, which is going to suppress the development of the Müllerian ducts, and therefore no oviduct, no uterus will form. And the testis will also release testosterone, which normally would masculinize the body. But in this case, because there's no functional androgen receptor to respond to it, the testosterone goes round and round, but the body doesn't respond. And so the Wolffian ducts don't develop. The periphery looks like a typical female. And these individuals, when they're born, often are not identified because the baby's born. The doctor does that very careful analysis by looking between the legs and says, congratulations, you have a girl. And they grow up to be girls, undetected. And they come to a doctor's attention when puberty happens, and all their classmates are having their period, but she's not. And so she'll eventually go to an OBGYN who will first do an exam, a vaginal exam, and he'll notice that the vagina is relatively short because the inner part of the vagina is normally derived from the Müllerian ducts. Well, in this woman, in this teenage girl, the Müllerian ducts never develop because of anti-Müllerian hormone. So there'll be no cervix that can be seen in the exam. And if he takes blood plasma levels, he'll see that this very feminine-looking girl, teenage girl, has very high levels of testosterone.
And presumably testes.
And if he does a karyotype, he'll see that she has an XY karyotype. And yes, there are testes in there, typically in the abdomen. And they're releasing lots of testosterone because there's no negative feedback to tell the brain, hey, you can stop sending signals to the testes now. In these cases, you can ask, well, what's the sexual orientation of these women? And the vast majority of them grow up to be straight. They are attracted to men. And they're often very interested in having a family. And of course, they can't carry children themselves, but they can, adopt and things like that. And so they're very much feminine, very straight women.
But they're XY.
But they're XYs. So the question is, and unfortunately, in terms of understanding whether prenatal testosterone alters our sexual orientation, these individuals aren't useful to us because we don't know if they're straight women because their brains could never respond to the prenatal testosterone, or are they straight women because they were raised as girls and socialized to be attracted to men? It's a fascinating syndrome, and there's at least one woman with AIS who's self-identified, who's a successful model, and there's another woman who wrote a memoir that's quite it's quite good. And what's interesting about it, when there's no testosterone response, they have very feminine faces, very feminine bodies, and so they're frankly quite attractive as women.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, Function. Function provides over 160 advanced lab tests to give you a clear snapshot of your bodily health. This snapshot gives insights into your heart health, hormone health, autoimmune function, nutrient levels, and much more. They've also recently added access to advanced MRI and CT scans. Function not only provides testing of over 160 biomarkers key to your physical and mental health, it also analyzes these results and provides recommendations for improving your health from top doctors. For example, in a recent test with Function, I learned that some of my blood lipids were slightly out of range. As a result, I decided to start supplementing with nattokinase, which can naturally help reduce LDL cholesterol, and it did. In a follow-up test, I could confirm that this strategy worked. My blood lipids are now back where I want them, in range. Comprehensive lab testing of the sort that Function offers is so important for health. And while I've been doing it for years, it's always been overly complicated and expensive. But now with Function, it's extremely easy and affordable. To learn more, visit functionhealth.com/Huberman and use the code Huberman for a $50 credit towards your membership. I'm realizing I'm drawing a model over here whereby we've got, again, accelerators and brakes. And I think we've got different axes. I'm not trying to split hairs here, but I think for people who want to understand how hormones, sex and behavior, sexual orientation fit together, it's very useful to think about, okay, you've got chromosomes that drive, our typical notions of male versus female, and you're providing some important caveats where the body appears one way, but it's an XY, and there's almost every derivation of this has been observed, although not at a very high frequency. And then you've got choice of same versus other in terms of orientation, and a key role of prenatal testosterone there. Maybe some cultural or other types of plasticity that might be biased more toward the female side. It seems that way based on what you're saying. If I'm willing to say it. If you're not, it does seem that way. There's an aversive signal that certainly in male sheep and other species, and that matches my observations as a 50-year-old male who grew up in Northern California, and again,
in this era,
and the joke being that I can only speak from my own reference point on this. And then we have a bunch of different things about partner preference, and that at some point it almost seems like it departs from, it certainly departs from our sort of linear, like, okay, girls like boys like girls, testosterone makes boys, estrogen makes girls. We're nowhere near there. We've left that station a long time ago.
Exactly.
And at the same time, we arrive at a place where I think we need better languaging to separate these axes, because it is very confusing for people. And so that would be very useful if the fields of neuroscience and psychology would start to embrace the real world realities of because I actually think the lack of specificity of talking about orientation versus biological sex and these other aspects have led, I think that's the source of a lot of conflict, actually. Anyway, that's an editorial for another time. In terms of biological impact on sexual orientation, one of the more striking findings that you've been talking about for a number of years that just kind of shocks at first, but then you get a lot of nods from people, is this idea that the larger the number of older brothers that a male has, the higher the probability that he is gay.
It's been seen over and over. I mean, it's really one of the rock solid findings in human sexuality that was first noticed by Ray Blanchard at Toronto and has been seen in many populations all over the world. So the way to emphasize the difference is if a baby boy is born today, if he has no older brothers, his odds of being gay when he grows up is about 2%, right? Pretty low. But if he had one older brother, his odds go up by a third. Okay, 2.6. And if he has two older brothers, they go up a third again. All right, now we're at 3.5. It turns out you got to have like a dozen older brothers just to have a 50-50 chance from the same mother.
Right. So we know that it's not, in what they call now blended family, or so this is.
We'll get to those in a moment, but this is what you see. So you get a big population of men. Here's a big population that have one older brother. How many are gay? And it's a small number. And the number that have two, still a small number, but more. And, how do you explain that? We saw it when we did those surveys. I don't know if you remember, we also asked people how many older brothers and sisters they had and how many younger brothers and sisters they had. So it turns out in the general population, there are about 105 boys born for every 100 girls, right? That's also very consistent.
105 boys born for every 100 girls.
That's right. So or put it another way, if you want, I can guess the sex of any baby that's going to be born, and I can be right more than 50% of the time because I'm always going to guess boy, right? Because 51% of the time it'll be a boy. For straight men, you total up all the older brothers they have and all the older sisters, and there's a ratio of about 105 older brothers to 100 older sisters. For the gay men, it turned out there were 140 older brothers for every 100 sisters.
Help frame that statistic for people. So you gave us the one older brother, what the probability was.
Right.
It's a third increase. You go from 2% to 2.6. Is it a linear increase as you increase the number of older brothers? Do you just start increasing the probability with every older brother, or is it sort of a step function?
It is, in fact, a linear progression. So at that rate, so Ray's worked that out. Of course, it's hard to find men that have had more than 4 or 5 older brothers, especially these days. But it turns out in the Kinsey surveys, Ray went to the Kinsey surveys way back then. Those interviews were incredibly thorough, and so they have a record of how many siblings of each sex every one of those men had, and you can see it there too. And it's another one of these cases where I tell you this and you tell me, well, I know somebody who has 2 older brothers and they're gay. Is that why?
Or I know somebody with 3 older brothers and they're not gay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you tell me, I know someone who has 2 older brothers and he's gay. Is that why he's gay? And I really can't tell you. There's no way to know because, in fact, most men with 2 older brothers are straight, right? Again, it's one of these instances where it gives you no predictive power about one individual, why they are gay. Ray Blanchard has done the statistics, and their estimate is of all the population of gay men, about 1 in 7 are gay because their mother carried brothers before them. And what I mean is those same men with the same genotype, same genes, if their mom hadn't had older brothers before them, they'd be straight today.
Statistically speaking.
But you show me a picture of the gay men's chorus, and I can't point out which man is gay because of that, because there are other factors that can influence whether someone grows up to be gay. So again, it's one of these things where the statistical comparison is of great theoretical importance, even though it offers no predictive value for a given individual.
So we know that males engage in much more rough and tumble play when they're younger, just like rats, just like monkeys. This is a fact. It's related to testosterone exposure. If a boy has older brothers, there's a decent chance he's engaging in more of that than if he has a sister. And given what you said earlier, that in humans, the brain continues to develop at a massively accelerated rate, even after birth, up to age 6, Testosterone has an influence. Behavior impacts testosterone. Okay, they're not in puberty yet, but you could imagine this has an impact. So the experiment becomes for boys that had 2 or more older brothers, but were not raised with those older brothers. Does the effect hold of them having a statistically greater probability of being gay?
It's a beautiful hypothesis. And you first hear about this, and that's the first thing you think, well, maybe the younger brother got bullied or
beat up his older brothers.
Maybe the older brother somehow inhibited the younger brother from developing in a full masculine fashion. But it turns out Tony Bogart started looking at these data, and he started asking, well, what about stepbrothers? Do older stepbrothers make any difference in the odds of sexual orientation? And the answer was a clear no. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, older brothers who came from the same mother but were raised apart had just as much of an effect as those that were raised with it. So it does not seem to be socially mediated. In fact, Ray Blanchard and Tony Bogart have come up with a very plausible hypothesis called the maternal immunization hypothesis. And it runs something like